Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Housing California, creating homes, health, and wealth for all Californians. I'd like to give a special thanks to the Executive Director, Lisa Hershey, and David Zister for allowing you guys to join us today, and give a special thanks to the conference team and Deanna Roberts as well. My name is Clean. I'm a hip-hop artist from Oakland, California, and today I'm about to perform a piece for you called American Dream, so I hope you enjoy.
We are in an acute housing crisis where you have mass unemployment, millions being pushed into poverty, millions facing eviction, and at the same time, millions of empty properties where either public officials or developers are just waiting to turn a profit. All of the ingredients for both a confrontation and occupation in the name of actually being able to provide people with decent places to live is on the table.
Listen, we've been uprooted from our history, gentrified. The place I proudly call home is now a distant drive. Listen, I remember when my little city couldn't get a second look. Now they invest in every penny. Pity when you can't live in the city you work. You drive 1,000 miles a day just so your pockets won't hurt. Trying to make it but can't escape it, no control on the rent. So you forced to move to the burbs or live your life in a tent. Another great migration from this housing inflation. Got my people on the streets. How I'm supposed to trust this nation when we battered, we broken, we losing, we hopeless. No FEMA on our team, I seen the soul dead in the open. I mean right in front that stove just about a block down from the church. Well, my boy just gave a sermon, did his thing, it was his first year. And the question he poses, are we there yet? Just take a look around, won't be no rare guess, I bet.
California ranks 49th out of 50 states when it comes to providing housing on a per capita basis. And it's estimated that this state needs to build at least 3.5 million units of housing by 2025 in order to catch up. We looked at one community that could provide some sort of model for the future.
Listen, Jim Crow of the West, that's what we dealing with. Segregation in plain sight, ain't no concealing it, nah. No racial covenant, this is obsolete. Them red lines then did the job, now it's about to feet. New racism is classism, a dressed up fascism. But it won't break me cause I done dealt with every last ism. Yep, that's what it is when you black in America. Every day is the Olympics, all the hurdles you carry them, burdens you bury them. It ain't no keeping us down. I walk around with a smile when they expecting a frown. So they scream at the marvel of the hue and they view. Sorry, Miss Jackson, Mississippi, don't love you like I do. We built this place up, how they displace us, what a sad scene. Zombies all around my town, it's like a bad dream. New world order, keep my brothers at the border. If they let them slide through, they gon' distort them. American dream.
Black folks that have been pushed out of
American dream.
Capitalism is racialized.
American dream.
But it is also carnivorous.
American dream.
And it will eat every single one of you too. It is never the problem for the people that are oppressed to demand the boots off our necks. Y'all down for this? Because if we don't do it, we won't get it.
Thank you guys for rocking with me today. Again, my name is Clean, and shout out to Housing California for putting on this wonderful event. Until next time, y'all enjoy the rest of the program.
Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this plenary session. And thank you to Clean for sharing your music and your message with us. I'm Matt Schwartz, the CEO of the California Housing Partnership. We provide technical assistance and publish applied research reports to help the field move forward. I have to say, just listening to Clean's one song, he just summed up the contents of an entire report we published about displacement and gentrification, and he did it so eloquently. So thank you, Clean. That was outstanding. 2 years ago, before we could imagine that a pandemic would soon jump from the realm of scary science fiction to become our reality, the staff of the California Housing Partnership committed to working with Housing California to develop what became the Roadmap Home. We made this commitment out of frustration that our state leaders, while well-intentioned, are locked into an annual piecemeal policymaking system, a Groundhog Day, if you will, that makes it impossible to tackle huge problems like the state's homelessness and affordable housing crisis. Notwithstanding the amazing proposals that the governor and legislature have put on the table with billions of dollars in new resources, the goal of our project was, and still is, to shift the thinking of leaders in Sacramento away from opportunistic, zero-sum, short-term thinking to adopt a long-term vision with clear goals that would lead to sustainable investments at scale to solve these problems that have been decades in the making. The intense pain caused by the pandemic, as well as the bold federal and state responses it has led to, have thrown into even sharper relief both the tremendous inequities that plague and weaken our society, as well as the hope we can have for a better future. The Roadmap Home 2030 lays out a comprehensive, racially equity-centered and evidence-based vision of that better future with a detailed 10-year map with more than 50 policy solutions to get us there. It is the product not just of the staff of our organizations who anchored the work, but of the hundreds of people with whom we consulted across the state, not just the experts, but also people with lived experience to ground us, including the fabulous Zella Knight from the Residents United Network, who we'll hear from shortly. The year-long process of developing the audacious goals that are at the heart of the Roadmap Home and the need for bold solutions at scale to make them real challenged me and the rest of the Roadmap team to our very cores. We were forced to reevaluate many of our assumptions about the status quo, about what is possible, and about what is necessary to do in order to achieve these goals, which are eliminate homelessness, protect vulnerable low-income residents and homeowners from displacement, make homes affordable and sustainable for all, and increase racial equity and address the racist land use and real estate finance system that has led to increasingly segregated neighborhoods and the huge gap in wealth that plagues us today. To achieve these goals, we need all of you to take ownership of and help build the Roadmap Home. The speakers in this plenary have all been leaders in the development of the roadmap and understand firsthand the need for the solutions it contains. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator and the president of the Housing California Board, Shioni Flegel. Shioni?
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for all your work to help get us here and to bring the roadmap together. I have so much appreciation for the staff of your organization and Housing California who really led this work and have given us such a tremendous resource to hold our collective vision and truly move to those 4 goals you laid out. Today, I have the great pleasure of facilitating a conversation with just 4 amazing women leaders who are helping to champion and bring real solutions to millions of Californians struggling to access safe, healthy, affordable homes and all of the wealth and benefit that those homes provide. I'm going to start by digging in with these 4 fabulous women to hear a bit more about their vision and values. Zella, I really want to turn to you first to have you introduce yourself and share a bit about what the roadmap captures for you and what the vision really means when you think about building a California with homes, health, and wealth for all.
Well, first of all, I'm honored and humbled to be here today. I'm Zella Knight. I'm a leader of Resident United Network, and I'm also an alumni of the Kelsey's Raise the Roof. As an American descendant of slavery, as a person living with disabilities, as a person living the experience of homelessness and housing insecurity, as a representative of marginalized communities, until we remove the visible and invisible chains and shackles of oppression, community will be just an illusion. And so for me, the vision that the roadmap captures is the clarion call to end homelessness, the centering of racial equity throughout, and the uplifting and centering of those of us most impacted as a basis of solution for resilience.
Thank you, Zella. Robin, I want to turn to you next and hear how you think about these issues and what your vision is for homes and health and wealth in California.
Thank you. So I'll start. I'm Robin Hughes. I'm president and CEO of Abode Communities. We're a nonprofit architecture development property management service organization based in Los Angeles. And so I really want to thank and acknowledge you for that opening. So I'm going to follow this from a practitioner standpoint. So I've been, doing this work for now over 3 decades. And so when I think about the plan and look at the plan and its vision, it's the boldness of the vision, that it's not shy about the solutions, that it takes big, bold, systemic, structural change in order to address the housing affordability and homeless crisis and housing instability that we face in this state. And that it is a plan that focuses on, I'll say, our most vulnerable and biggest needs in the state, including extremely low and low income households, as well as people experiencing homelessness, but it also provides a range of housing solutions, which I think is really important, and that those housing solutions are everywhere throughout our state, so that we're building housing in the communities where people live, but we're also providing opportunities and neighborhoods that have opportunities and have typically been exclusive to people of color. So I like the boldness of the plan.
Thank you, Robin. Dr. Margot, I'm going to turn to you next. Can you start by introducing yourselves and share some of your vision with the rest of us?
Sure. My name is Margot Kuchel, and I am a professor of medicine at UCSF, where I direct the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative and a board member of Housing California. So I think what captures me about the roadmap is its scope and its scale. I feel like for too long, we've talked about housing and homelessness when we've talked about them at all from a lens of scarcity. And we've really disconnected conversations about homelessness and housing, blaming individuals' vulnerabilities instead of looking at the massive structural inequities that we have baked into our system. And then we've tried to solve homelessness by seeking one-off solutions for a small group of people in front of us without recognizing there really isn't any meaning to a phrase, a homeless person, but we have a system that is really born and bred through racism that's left millions of people without inadequate housing. And so what speaks to me about the roadmap is its connection of the homelessness crisis to the housing crisis, its naming of racism, correctly so, at the heart of this problem and speaking to what an equitable future would look like, its honest accounting of the costs of solving these crises, and its clear message of how we can raise revenue at scale. So I really love how it creates a roadmap to end the scarcity and get to the root cause. And I find the boldness of it to actually be quite optimistic. We've been locked so long into this sense we can't even do this, why even try, that we keep underinvesting in the solutions. And then we use the fact that these limited, inadequate solutions fail as proof that we can't do this. And so the roadmap really defies this and reminds us that we know how to solve these crises. We know how to build a California that fulfills its promise, and it shows us how we get there. So I love the roadmap's honesty, its boldness, and its optimism.
Thank you. Tamika, we'd love to hear from you next. If you could introduce yourselves and share your vision.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this esteemed panel of incredible leaders. My name is Tamika Moss, and I'm the founder and CEO of All Home. We are an organization that works across the 9-county Bay Area to lift up regional solutions to address homelessness and housing insecurity, and really think about the racial disparities that exist within the population of folks experiencing homelessness. And first of all, I just want to echo and amen everything that has already been said. I think what is visionary to me about the roadmap is a similar theme that my colleagues have lifted up, which is it's audacious enough to believe that we can solve these problems. I think California and many places in the country, but especially California, who represents the 5th largest economy on the planet, who has such incredible innovation and leadership, has given in to the fact that homelessness is a part of our society, that we have failed our neighbors of being able to solve this challenge at scale. And what the roadmap suggests is that actually is false. and that we can no longer, policymakers, community members, say that we don't know how to do it, that we don't have a set of solutions that work. Many of us who've been at this a long time know that these solutions can work. And I think Margot said it well. You can't underinvest in solutions and then blame them for not working. And so what is inspiring to me is that we can situate our local, regional, statewide efforts in this roadmap and work with communities to really accelerate all the great work that's already happening and do it quickly. Even though we're looking at a 10-year time horizon, I think the sense of urgency, and I think Zella speaks to this most eloquently, is now. We can no longer accept that our brothers and sisters who are living on our streets and struggling to find affordable housing for their families, that is not only not okay, but we can't continue to let that be a 5 to 7 year time horizon by the time we get to you and figure out how to support our community in being housed. So I am both optimistic and grateful for the vision that the roadmap lays out.
Thank you all for sharing those visions, which are such a wonderful reflection of what the roadmap is laying out. At the top of the conversation, Matt shared the 4 bold goals in the roadmap around building 1.2 million affordable homes, ending homelessness in California, protecting low-income renter households, and closing racial equity gaps in housing and homelessness. The roadmap also provides us with 5 areas for structural change to deliver on these goals. It talks about investing in our values by thinking about how we raise and allocate money towards solutions. It talks about restructuring our tax and finance systems so that they're more equitable and operating at scale to give us the resources we need. It talks about reimagining how our communities grow, how we use land to undo historic racism and create opportunity. And then it talks about protecting people and creating efficiency and accountability by putting people before profits and creating more streamlined housing systems. I want to move us into a conversation to really think about how we start to deliver towards those prongs and bring them into action. And Zella, I'm going to start with you. You've not been shy about sharing your own experiences and have spoken powerfully about the lived experiences that so many Californians face as they struggle to stay housed. What do we have to lose if we don't act to realize this vision? What do you see is at stake? What are the real life, collective, and individual consequences that you see for us?
It is said that life is not about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. But for so many of us, we've got that dark cloud hovering over us every single day. The idea of having your health challenged with the stress of whether or not you can stay in the foundation of your home, whether or not you're going to be put out on the street at any given time, and where are you going to collect the resources? Where are you going to maintain the resources? And so any further delay in the implementation of the roadmap, it's obvious. We're going to lose more lives. What the pandemic did, it just exacerbated the fact that we already knew. We had challenges and dark storms that we never provided viable solutions for, and thus we lost lives. I as a leader, I going through this journey cannot sit well with that fact happening, lives being lost. So we've got to get up as a collective. We've got to enforce these 57 concrete solutions to save lives.
Thank you, Zella. And I hope you will put that beautiful quote that you opened with in the chat, because I know I would love to take it home with me and imagine others would as well. Margot, your work sits at the intersection of health and housing, and you've thought a lot about what it will take for us to recover in a way that leaves us better off than we were before the pandemic. What about the 4 bold goals and structural changes resonates with the work you're doing? How should they inform our path to recovery?
Yeah, I mean, I come to this work as a primary care physician. And so someone who sees my life's work is helping people live healthy lives. But pretty early on, I realized that when it comes to health, there really is no medicine as powerful as housing. We are willing to spend inordinate amounts of money on medical care, but none of it really matters if we don't ground people in safe and affordable housing. And I think the COVID pandemic laid this out clearly. The horrific suffering from the pandemic in many ways has been the story of essential workers living in overcrowded and inadequate housing. We saw COVID spread like wildfire through homeless shelters. And I think what we talked even less about was how it spread like wildfires through crowded households. And so we live in a state where our most essential workers, and frankly, people whose work is so essential that they weren't able to stay home for their safety, are the same people who are living 10, 12, 14 people in tiny apartments, crowding in to be able to pay the rent. And so these households, which are disproportionately Black and Brown, suffer disproportionately. You know, viruses themselves are value neutral, but they exploit our existing vulnerabilities. And our failed policies on housing, frankly, left our communities really vulnerable to this lethal virus. And so I think COVID made really clear that the status quo can't hold. You know, we've got 160,000 people sleeping homeless every night and millions more who are living in substandard, overpriced, unaffordable housing, who are not only at risk for homelessness, but also currently experiencing a lot of harm. So I think what the roadmap says to us is, as we try to rebuild our economy and rebuild our health, we really need to have a laser-like focus on equity, and housing justice really needs to be front and center of that recovery. If we don't do that, not only are we leaving ourselves vulnerable for the next pandemic, but frankly, to the horrific health outcomes that we see day in and day out in our housing crisis. So, you know, when I think about recovery, I think about a world in which all Californians have access to affordable, safe housing so that we can thrive, because there really is no recovery without that.
Thank you. Tamika, I'm going to turn to you next. You're working to address some of the most egregious consequences of our failure to act. The roadmap lays out a clear path for how to solve the entire problem, but our state and local leaders continue to struggle to move solutions at scale. And I've already seen some questions in the chat around this, but how do we help push policymakers in particular, but really all of us, past the like, this sounds good, but we can't actually do it? How do we help move them beyond that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I first and foremost think it has to do with our mind shift, the paradigm shift, again, that we have become so incredibly cynical about our belief to address homelessness at scale. You know, when you see a plan like the roadmap or some of the regional work that All Home is doing, folks kind of roll their eyes and be like, that price tag is too high. We're never going to be able to have enough resources to do that. Our housing policies are broken. But I think the biggest anecdote to me about that line of thinking is that we don't have a choice. Zella said it, lives are at stake, and not just for the people who are most impacted by this crisis, but I actually think the entire region, the entire state of California, viability is at stake. If we are not able to take care of our most vulnerable residents and incorporate those residents into our community and present opportunities for them to thrive, we are throwing away the next generation of leaders. We have abandoned young people and children who are experiencing homelessness in our state because we have decided that we don't have enough to figure out how to solve this problem at scale. And I think we have to, as a community, every single member of our society, whether you are a business leader, you are a public servant, you are a person experiencing this crisis directly, a community-based organization person, everyone has to recognize that we have to bring our collective assets to the table to be able to solve this problem. And the problem is structural. That's why the most egregious consequences are what we see in front of us. Homelessness is a manifestation of our societal failures to address the structural barriers that have been placed in our way since the beginning, the formation of the United States, if we're going to be honest about it. And so you don't get there through programmatic interventions. You don't get there by applying millions of dollars to billion-dollar problems. So we have to be able to lift ourselves up and recognize that we are not passively allowing this to happen in our communities, and we don't have to guess what it's going to take. The roadmap and other incredible efforts have not only laid out the solutions, but they've also given us the intersectional nature of how those solutions relate to each other, and that we can work on them simultaneously. We can walk, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I believe in us. So I'm excited that we have the tools to keep it moving and be bold, be courageous. Now is the time.
Thank you, Tamika, for those inspiring words. Robin, you have been a leader in the mission-driven affordable housing development world, not only thinking about the full spectrum of solutions necessary to improve life outcomes for the folks that you house and serve, but also thinking about how you change the conditions of the disinvested communities many of these individuals are coming from. How do we build broader alignment across the housing sector to really deliver on this change that we need, that's thinking both about people and the places that they're living in? You're still muted, Robin.
I knew that would happen to one of us. So as I said earlier about the roadmap home, is that it is bold in its solution. And one of the things that I point out is that it calls for $17.9 billion per year invested in solving housing affordability and homeless in our state. And they equate that to what the state is investing in higher education. So imagine if we took this wonderful system of higher education, public higher education that we have in this state, and applied that to housing instability and homelessness. Do we ever, or does our state legislature ever ask itself, do we have to fund our higher education system? No, not at all. The resources are there. They struggle, but there is a state commitment to do that. We need that same shift in political culture up in Sacramento around housing and homelessness, that we're not coming from a place of scarcity, that we're coming from a place of resources. And I love what Tamika said earlier about investing. When we invest less money than we need into solving a problem and then blaming the solution on the failure to solve the problem, that we have to make this bold investment. And the way we do it as a affordable housing sector is that we have to come together as a coalition and work together as a coalition. But it begins with, and I again love that Zella's here, that we have to bring in those folks and center it on people that are most impacted by housing instability and homelessness, and make people the center of this coalition. But I can imagine, we have our two statewide organizations, trade associations, we have our regional and local trade associations. If each association adopted this roadmap as their policy agenda for the next 10 years, and we're speaking in Sacramento in a single voice around the resources that are needed to successfully address the issues, that would be pretty amazing. So I think that's a really important part of the solution. We also have to think about how we bring this to the media. I know locally here in Los Angeles, a big part of what got HHH and H on the ballot a few years ago is that it was in the media everywhere. So how can we take this roadmap home and create a marketing and PR campaign to get the solutions out there? And we also have to, the roadmap home calls for endorsements by us as organizations, but also pushing our state legislature to adopt this. And then I think it's taking, bit by bit, and we can talk about this later on. It's like each and every year, how do we take priorities from this roadmap and make sure that we are adopting and pushing legislation in Sacramento for it to happen? But I think it really does take a broad coalition on the same campaign with the same voice, shifting that culture up in Sacramento in terms of investment in housing and homelessness in this state.
Thank you, Robin. That's a wonderful through line from some of the conversations we heard earlier this morning with Heather McGee and the real need to think about building multiracial coalitions that center equity and people with lived experience. I want to talk a bit about how we start to make these solutions actionable. So we've all kind of lifted up the boldness of the vision and goals of the roadmap, and Matt named at the top that it includes over 50 concrete solutions, policy solutions to get us there, which can feel overwhelming, and it's not a silver bullet. The work's not easy, but all of you are engaged in work to actually translate those policy solutions into actionable change. And I'd love to hear, maybe starting with you, Tamika, how we make the solutions actionable and how we bring them to life for people.
Yeah, another great question, Shioni. I wanted to just lift up something Robin just said, which I think is sort of a challenge for our policymakers, which is having the discipline to stay with strategies that actually work over time. Having worked for mayors and in the public sector, I understand that the cadence of policy change is often cyclical and tied to electoral cycles. And what we need with this strategy, with the roadmap home, is we need a sustained, persistent, and disciplined investment and attention on the solutions that work over a 10-year period. So we shouldn't find that the next elected cycle of leaders have to come up with a new strategy and try to figure out what we need to do. The way you make it actionable is that you apply the policy recommendations year over year, you stay disciplined, you stay accountable to results, right? Constituencies who put folks in office want to know whether or not our strategies are working, and if they're not, make adjustments and figure out what to do next. But we've never had that discipline, I think, and I think if we're able to figure out how do we sustain and institutionalize the commitment to these strategies and policies, and then hold ourselves accountable both as government, but also on the ground. How do local and county jurisdictions look at actual reductions in homelessness year over year? We at All Home have proposed a regional action plan to reduce unsheltered homelessness by 75% by 2024 in the Bay Area. And what that looks at is bringing as many folks indoors as quickly as possible, but not stopping there. We are not trying to bring people into temporary housing without permanent exits and solutions for them to live and thrive in their communities. So we need simultaneous investments in interim, permanent, and prevention to address homelessness that actually helps communities have the resources that they need to bring our neighbors inside, to transition folks into permanent housing, and to prevent homelessness in the first place. When I was a practitioner, and Robin can attest to this, as can my other panelists, we are seeing more people fall into homelessness faster than we can house them. Los Angeles, I think, is a fantastic example. They house thousands of people a month, thousands. And yet so many more, and particularly in the pandemic, are falling into homelessness faster than we can house them. So I think investing in prevention and not being forced into these false choices of, well, if we invest in prevention, we can invest in permanent housing. And if we invest in permanent housing, we have to do it all. And I think actualizing this plan holds jurisdictions accountable for actual population level reductions in homelessness, holds our policymakers accountable for providing sustainable resources that communities can rely on in order to end this crisis once and for all.
Thank you. Zella, I would love to hear you speak about the work you're doing to translate these recommendations into action. You're doing a ton of work to bring them to life. Can you share some of that with our audience?
The most important piece here, and my esteemed colleague Tamika spelled out something in regards to discipline, but I see that as a hindrance. It ain't about discipline. It's about survival. Many of the residents that I serve, that I partner with, that I lead with, that I guide with, their lives are at stake. We do not have any further time to talk about, to plan about, to structure about. The clarion call has been made. Lives have been lost. The clarion call has been made. We've got to do better as a collective California. To level set this, as I indicated before, we've got to take out those visible and invisible shackles of oppression. Those still exist. No matter what we do until we equal the playing field for affordable housing for all, the human right, none of this is going to matter. So let's have those candid conversations, absolutely, but it's beyond conversation. It is time to hold folks accountable. And when I say affirm, I mean planted in regards to racial equity. Get rid of it, dispel it, destroy it, so that California can be the land of opportunity for all. The other side of the fence that I also want to address is that invisible element that we sometimes neglect in conversation, and that is accessibility. We have had multi-plans in regards to persons with disabilities in the efforts to get accessible housing, and everyone benefits. Policy Links leader had a beautiful context in regards to the curb cutting effect. That was originally designed as an accessible tool for those of us who have accessibility canes, wheelchairs at all. But there's a benefit for all. Persons with children in strollers, the shopping cart, when your feet hurt, all of those elements benefit all. So in this effort, it is time for all of us to stand up together, all of us to clearly articulate that at any given time, if we continue with the negative, we're going to all be in the homeless cycle for decades. And let's be affirmative in holding our policymakers accountable in the effort to have safe, affordable housing for all. So I'm calling everybody to come run with me. Get involved with Resident United Network, the Kelsey. You've got a wealth and breadth of partners here that we are like-minded in this effort for an affordable element of California that benefits all for all.
Thank you, Zella. Margot, you work in a sector that is not known for being engaged in housing advocacy, but you've certainly heeded Zella's call to join the work and to bring your voice and expertise in. What does it look like for you to bring the vision of the roadmap and the recommendations it contains to life?
Yeah, Zella, thank you for those powerful words. I think you're absolutely 100% right, Zella, right? This is an emergency and lives are on the line. And I think it's to the shame of the health sector that they have not been active partners in this. There's this, the health sector takes up a huge part of our GDP and really has been absent in these conversations. And there's just no, there's really, if we actually were true to our words and actually said that what we cared about was health, this is what we'd be focused on. So I think to bring this to life, we also need to bring in all different sectors, for our teachers and our educators. They can't educate when the children are going home to, vastly overcrowded housing or homelessness. For us as healthcare providers, we definitely can't bring health. And I think that we need to light a little bit of a fire. We can't wait until the next pandemic. The pandemic made things much worse, but it worsened things that were already there, and we see it every day. And so I think, for me, I feel like what's important is to play this role for the health sector to try to get the health sector on board in a meaningful way. Like, I would love to see the health sector using their incredible political power to bring to this, but I think we really do, to bring these alive, need to make it clear to everybody. We can't keep putting homelessness and housing costs as a #1 problem in California and then having nothing happen, right? Having none of the laws pass and none of the funding come through. And so I think we need to be really hell-bent on saying people can't just complain about this, right? We need to actually change our practices, our policies to get us to where we need to go. And I think we, perhaps as like the housers, need to reassure people we actually know what to do. What we just need is the political will to do it.
Thank you. Robin, what's going through your head? How do we make these solutions actionable? What does it look like from where you sit?
Yeah, this is such a great panel because, people have already said my thoughts, but I'll try and say them in a different way, which, I go back to the discipline and the accountability. The roadmap home, there's clarity in it. And that's the thing that I love about it. They're really clear recommendations on what's going to solve the structural systemic problems that we have around housing and homelessness. So it's an absolutely beautiful plan. So I think Tamika's point about the discipline, let's take this plan and commit to the plan for the next 10 years. And, we've already seen in this legislative year some policies or legislation that's been adopted as a result of this plan. But each year, let's sort of pick off which components of these plans can be implemented either through legislation or programmatic changes or structural changes within our system. And then it's that accountability, and the accountability is with our state legislature, but it's also these opportunities to hold local government accountable as well. I love that the plan doesn't just look at funding, but it also looks at land use. And we know that land use has been used in so many ways to exclude people of color in certain neighborhoods, to exclude low-income people in certain neighborhoods. So how do we change the way in which we approach land use so that we have more inclusive land use and that we're building housing, affordable housing, permanent supportive housing throughout our cities, throughout our regions, so that we have more balanced communities. So that is a really important part of the work that we see here. So I think it is that discipline and then holding our elected officials and government accountable for the work that we do.
Thank you. I want to ask all of you now to kind of open the world of possibility. Again, I'm thinking about Heather talking about luxuriating in that world of possibility and what we want for the future. What, as you think outside the box, what are the solutions that might seem implausible, but that you think are the right kind of paradigm shift for us now? And I'm going to start with you, Margot. I want to hear your thinking, and these can be ideas that are in the roadmap, and maybe they're ones that we haven't yet discussed and that aren't there yet.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I think we need to be thinking more on the lines of housing as a right. I think when I talk to medical audiences, the things that sort of surprise them is, that things like the housing choice voucher program is not an entitlement, that you sort of have to not only do you have to qualify for these overly strict qualifications, but you actually have to win the lottery. And that, I think, comes from this mindset somehow that housing is somehow not essential, right? And I think that we really need to move away from that mindset. You hear people talking about shelter as a right, which actually, to be honest, makes me nervous, because it makes me think that we're gonna just warehouse people in these big, warehouses that are not actually housing, and then everyone's gonna forget about it because everyone's gonna think, oh, they can't see it. So I think we actually need to start having honest conversations about what it would mean to have housing as a right, and how that would flip our thinking about how we really fund and promote these solutions, because we don't have shelter as a right, but shelter is not housing. What we really need is to be bold and to say that for us to have a California that functions, people need to have, that needs to come from a place of right. So I guess if I had to do that, that might be the bold thing, because I think if we flipped our thinking that way, we don't say to kindergartners, there's not enough room in your kindergarten class. We do a lot of other things wrong with educational system. We underfund it, we do that. But what we don't do is say, oh, sorry, there's no room for you. That just isn't actually how we think about it. And so I would love to see us switch our thinking on housing in that way.
Thank you, Robin. What about you? What might seem implausible, but is critical to where we want to go?
So I'm going to build on what Margaret just said, which is if we perceive housing as a right, then the way in which we preserve, produce, and protect tenants and housing would completely shift. So all of those structural barriers, all of the barriers that we face in production and preservation, all of the uncertainty people have around their housing would be eliminated. And so I will focus on what I know, which is producing housing. It should not take 5-10 years to produce affordable housing. It really should not. So if we thought about housing as a human right, again, we're not coming from a place of scarcity. So how do we actually deliver on the ground the housing that we need to house everyone? And you do that by eliminating the barriers to getting the work done. So we wouldn't have to go through extreme land use entitlements on every single project. We wouldn't have to layer 5 sources of financing that take 2 years to gather to produce our housing. We shouldn't have to, quite frankly, sometimes layer on other public benefits that make our housing so incredibly affordable too. It's like if we start breaking those pieces down, we can deliver housing more quickly, less expensive, and get people stable in their homes and thriving if we're able to do that. So I could just imagine a system where it takes me 2 years to produce a housing development as opposed to 5 and 10. So how do we eliminate those barriers? And someone said something the other day in a summit I was in, and it's perhaps not eliminating the barriers, it's really reframing the structure in which we do our work. It really does have to look different than it does today. So, that would be my desire at the end of the day.
Thank you. Tamika, what about you? How do we kind of blow the roof off this problem?
I think, what comes to mind for me is that housing security is inextricably linked to economic security. You cannot have incomes that are insufficient to be able to pay your rent. And I don't care how cheap you make housing, if we don't pay attention to the income side and figure out how to get competitive wages that are accessible to low income workers. When I was in this work directly, we had 50% of the families that were homeless were working. So we cannot continue to have wages that are insufficient to meet the rents of our state. And I think we have a math problem. that is just getting worse for more and more people. Extremely low income households who are earning less than $35,000 a year are unable to afford most rents in this state. And so I think one of the transformative elements of this problem needs to be looking at bringing more of our employers to the table to think about pipelines of opportunity that actually create economic mobility for formerly homeless and extremely low income households. Because let's be clear, folks actually want to take care of themselves, and folks want to make money and be self-sufficient. And if we have not only designed the structure so those things are inaccessible to them, then we have a housing market that is inaccessible to earners earning over $100,000 a year. What the hell do we expect? So we can't keep, looking at the problem and being surprised when we really look at the data and the evidence around why these challenges exist in the first place. So I agree with my colleagues, housing is a right, because if it is a public good, then we treat it as such, which means it is then accessible to the public. And there are places around the globe that have figured this out. So this is not a new concept. And let's figure out economic mobility opportunities for our most vulnerable residents so they're not just sustaining their poverty, but they get a chance to transition into thriving.
Thank you, Tamika. Zella, I'm going to let you have the kind of final word for this round before we start to open it up and take questions from the audience. What do you think we need to really shift our paradigm and step outside of the box?
First and foremost, as always, the permanent seats of those of us who are at the experience, those of us who are living this, breathing this, suffering this. That's at the decision-making table, beginning, middle, and end. That's first and foremost. Secondly, it is the enforcement and monitoring of the racial equity piece that we need to have a priority. As Tamika alluded to, we've got a wealth and breadth of data that is available to us. But if that data doesn't get us to the solution, again, we suffer. Those of us in the trenches who are living this suffer. So we have to stand on the enforcement and monitoring piece that is embedded within the roadmap. It calls it out. It says that we are going to, on a monthly, bi-monthly, some proponent of timeline, measure out the racial equity piece to ensure that all Californians are getting a benefit in this process. This roadmap is a walking journey for all of us. But again, if we keep centered and focused in regards to lives are at stake, no matter how we have to pivot or shift, the end game is getting that outcome. And that is our priority.
Thank you. So I'm going to try and pull in some of the questions from our audience. And the first question I'm going to really let any of you answer. But we have an audience member who wants to know what's some advice you would give Black, Indigenous, and people of color youth in regards to housing and representation? Who can we connect to be more efficient in getting proper housing in our communities? And I'll let you all jump in, whoever wants to take that first.
I'll take it on. I will invite the youth to come run with me, Resident United Network. We're empowering, we're standing in the gap, we're living the experience, we're breathing the experience. So that is where I embrace you and my colleagues embrace you totally. We're not in this alone. This is going to be a generational by generational task that we've got to affirm that all lives matter.
Absolutely. And I guess I would just add, I think what's so important about addressing youth homelessness is hearing from our young people around what they need that is unique to their experience. I think that there are a lot of us, and there are amazing organizations doing this work locally and nationally, Larkin Street Youth Services, all over the state, who are lifting up and prioritizing young people experiencing homelessness, particularly our Black, Brown, and Indigenous LGBTQ youth. And so I think not only having a seat at the table, but really working to organize each other around the resources needed to make sure that their needs are met. There's a ton of advocacy happening at the state level to increase the amount of funding that the governor and the legislature is contemplating in this budget package. I think now is the time. The budget will be released soon. Reach out to your lawmakers. Work with Zella. Get your voice out there, because now is the time to make sure people are prioritizing our young people as a part of the solution.
Yeah, I was just thinking, we just recently opened a development in Southwest LA for transition age youth and homeless families. And that is one of two developments that we have in our pipeline that's focused on youth. And I think perhaps my early silence is that we are not producing enough housing to address homeless youth in our community. And so I think that advocacy voice, making sure that you are around the table when things like this are being discussed. I was here locally on a ad hoc committee focusing on Black homeless here in LA, and there were a number of youth advocates as part of that discussion, and it made a really big difference. So I do think having the voice at the table and pushing and advocating for resources to be prioritized for youth who are experiencing homelessness, especially Black and Indigenous people of color.
Thank you all. I want to dig us in a little bit to some of the questions around building movement and political momentum. This year, one of the big challenges that the housing community has faced is a real sharp divide between people who are looking to fund and build affordable housing and the California state building trades. At Housing California, and I would just say in my work at PolicyLink, we really believe that we both need to raise the floor for workers and make sure that they are paid well and have high quality jobs across all sectors, and that we have millions of homes to build and projects to fund to serve people who are struggling to have secure, healthy housing. How do you all see us overcoming this divide and really building the solutions that we need to arrive at new and kind of different ways to produce? How do we do this in light of the current political context that we're faced with?
So I'll start on this one. I don't know if we have a solution, but I think as a sector, a movement, we have an opportunity to advance. So I'll start with what you said, which is I believe that all of us doing this work feel like we can balance both. We can balance having affordable housing, permanent supportive housing, and ensuring the construction workers are paid, living wages, prevailing wages in the sector. But a system that puts in place such restrictions as that have been proposed that one reduces a workforce that can work on our affordable housing is a challenge, that increases cost associated with our affordable housing is a challenge, but also that excludes perhaps even smaller contractors of color, women-owned contractors of being involved in the sector. Those are things that we have to make sure that any system that we're putting in place are not continuing to put in exclusion for folks to access this type of work. So I do think that we have to continue to talk as a sector about the number of jobs that we're creating through our work, the fact that we're paying the wages for people not only to live, but to thrive in their community. And that I think needs to be the message that we're sending out as a sector, that we can do both. We can deliver housing and pay really great construction jobs and be inclusive, not exclude other folks.
Yeah, I think that's right, Robin. And I just would add something Zella said earlier, which I think we don't spend enough time on, which is focusing on outcomes. Every single element of the ecosystem, labor, the producers of housing, the service providers, the people experiencing homelessness, everyone actually is focused on the outcome of ending homelessness and housing insecurity, or should be. Whether you are somebody in the trades, you're an educator, you're whatever your role. And so if we're able to focus on the outcomes, we don't get to just go to our respective corners and be unwilling to negotiate or compromise on solutions. So if we have 1.2 million homes we got to get done over the next 10 years, we need grownups at the table who are, leaving their egos and their personality politics behind and being like, boom, what do we collectively need to do? We have a labor shortage. We actually don't have enough workers to produce that level of housing. So I would say to my labor brother and sisters, how do we get y'all enough workers so that we can get the housing done? I would say to my housers, what do y'all need to be able to produce the housing quickly and more cost effectively? I would say to Margot's people, how are we going to align social services and behavioral health supports to the people, right? So everybody actually has a responsibility to bring their assets to the table, and you don't get to be shutting things down and shutting it down because lives are at stake. So I think if we start with outcomes and work backwards and figure out what it would take across the entire spectrum to get us to those outcomes, we might have a shot at breaking through some of these perennial challenges that have allowed housing production to stall.
Thank you both. Our next question is something that I think all of you engage in different ways, but it's really around how do we push for change at the local level? One of our guests speaks to the challenge that, writing letters isn't always enough. So how do we help push our local policymakers to bring real solutions into communities? And again, I know many of you are thinking both about state, but are also working at the local. So would love to hear you reflect and kind of offer some recommendations for folks who may be looking to engage in that way.
I can take that on. And to the commenter who said that, don't give up. Those letters do matter. They are effectuating change. You may not see it in the global sense, but they are making those incremental changes that save lives. And so continue to stand. You're not going to get the instant response, and that is not the expectation. We want to build into this, to grind into this so that it sustains and that it saves. And so keep doing what you do. Don't give up. Stand.
Anyone else want to add to that one? Tamika, I see you, and Dr. Kushel.
I think it's really important, first of all, as Zella says, those letters do count. They do make a change. I think holding our local leaders accountable for this, because, ultimately the funding for this is probably more likely going to come from the state and federal level at the scale we need it. But the problem is that local leaders can do a lot to grind things to a halt, right? So that they need to be on board. And I think we need to make sure that in every community we're talking to our neighbors and your friends about showing up, holding our local leaders accountable. And I can't say enough about also showing up because I feel like the folks who are opposing things, like when we're trying to build new housing in communities, the folks who oppose it all show up. They come in their matching t-shirts, with their signs. And a lot of people of goodwill who are like, oh, I would love, I wouldn't mind. I would love to have an apartment building next door and, neighbors of all incomes and everything like that. Because it seems obvious to them that they would like that, they don't necessarily show up. And so I always say to people, on that Tuesday night, when there's a zoning discussion, which seems incredibly boring, grab a few neighbors, make it a date, go and show up and speak out for those things. So holding local leaders accountable, asking them at every candidate event, at every time you meet with them, what are you doing to solve this problem? And also don't forget how important it is when these micro decisions are being made, the opposition will show up. So we need to show up too.
Thank you, Dr. Kushel. We actually have another question that I'm going to direct to you. One of our guests asks, how can hospitals and the community benefits that they bring be required or pushed to contribute more significantly to communities? And I know there's been a number of efforts to actually legislate this and work that folks have done in communities around the state, but how do you see taking on that work? What does it look like?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And as I said, I think that the healthcare field has not shown up in the big enough way, or when they do, it actually is by making like a one-time, donation, not at scale. I think things like 1152, which required hospitals to have a plan of where to send people who lack a home when they're discharged, made everyone, it didn't have any teeth to it, and so people are still discharging patients to the street. And that is shameful. And also, I think, hospitals often say, well, I can't keep this person here for 6 months. And they're right, actually, they can't keep that person there for 6 months. But what I would like to see is the next stage. Well, then what are you going to do about it? How are you going to use your political power? How are you going to use your community benefits? I worry that community benefits are often used to sort of write off bad debt or like for, care that's given. And to me, that should not be part of the story. You see some institutions doing things like becoming anchor institutions, which is a really, I think, important movement where hospitals are making affirmative statements that they are often big employers in the communities. They are, essential. They have a lot of often, property, and that they really need to look at all of their practices, their employment practices, their procurement practices, and their community benefits. And so I think expanding that would also be important. But I think that we need to push back. And I say this as a healthcare provider, but when hospitals sort of say, well, what do you want me to do? I can't keep this person here for 6 months. They are right. That would not be healthy for the individual to stay in a hospital for 6 months, and what they really need is housing. But I think we need to push it a little further and say to the healthcare industry, well, what are you doing then to solve this problem?
I'm going to invite, if others want to weigh in on that, I'm going to invite you to give you a chance to, otherwise I'll move to the next question.
I guess I was just going to add that I think this is analogous to many institutions that discharge people into community without housing. You see this with folks coming out of the criminal justice system and not having access to stable housing. And then we wonder why folks recidivate when people don't have community supports in place. And I think some of the solution is working with folks before they are released from these institutions and getting housing plans together, just like we do navigation support services in community. Why couldn't we start working with our parole board and our probation departments in advance, working with the formerly incarcerated individuals, looking at family connections, looking at resources. And frankly, there are a lot of resources we spend on we spend $20 billion a year on corrections across the state. And that should include a comprehensive look at housing supports, as well as employment and other community needs that folks have when they exit the system. So I think it's analogous to these institutions, healthcare and others really stepping up and taking responsibility around that public good, which is housing.
Yeah, I recently heard of a program, I think it was in Pittsburgh, and in particular, it focused on this one woman who was experiencing housing instability, floating from family member to family member, but then also using the healthcare system sort of as her shelter or housing use. And she spent a lot of time in the hospital. So the particular hospital had a program where they would actually provide free housing for someone. So somehow, and I didn't get the details on sort of directing premium to pay for housing. And with this particular woman, just within a year, was having stable housing that she could afford. Her hospital visits went down, her overall health was improved, and it was less costly than her using the hospital as her shelter, as her stability in her life. So I do think finding a way for the healthcare system to engage and support the housing system, especially people that are experiencing homelessness and housing instability, and making that link and connecting the resources to actually deliver the housing for the people that need it, I think is really important.
I'm going to try and squeeze in one more power round question because we have a lot of questions about political momentum. And as somebody who is a policy advocate working on housing, it resonates a lot with me in the last year, 15 months since the pandemic started. It's been so demoralizing the number of times that we've heard, or I've heard state policymakers say, well, renters aren't our issue right now, or, we don't hear about these issues. We're not hearing stories about people being impacted. That this isn't what we really need to be dealing with. So I'm super interested in hearing from all of you, and I think our guests are too, for ideas on how do we actually build the political momentum and will to create change, to create the change that we've laid out in this roadmap Home 2030. How do we get there through that political momentum?
I can take that on immediately. Let us stop voting on personality and start voting on principle. That is the first wave to this. You as a constituent, a taxpayer, a stakeholder in this, you have dynamic power to move the agenda through your vote. And so that is the important aspect of this. If you see that there is someone who doesn't agree with your values, with your principles, do not elect them.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. I think that taking back our power around who actually represents us around these issues is critically important. We have, many bodies that make really significant decisions around how we spend our resources and how we prioritize this issue. And if they are not representing your interests, voting is a way to hold folks accountable. I guess I would also say, though, that people in community want to see results. Folks want to see less human suffering. Folks want to see more people housed. Folks want to see that our solutions really do work and can scale. So I think the political momentum we need to build are demonstrating success, demonstrating that we can take that 161,000 people relative. Now, there are 40 million people in the state of California. If you actually think about it, if we provided homes for 161,000 people in the next decade, come on, we are the 5th largest economy on the planet. So relative to how many people need a home, relative to the people who are most at risk of homelessness, if we set some goals that we could actually demonstrate success on, reducing racial disparities. We shouldn't continue to have communities where 37% of the population of those experiencing homelessness are Black and less than 5% of the general population is Black. Everywhere in the state has at least a 5-fold increase around. We can do better. We must do better, but we can only do better if we believe better is possible. And if we keep seeing the same failure happen over and over, the public will lose trust and has lost trust that we can handle this issue. And so I think we build political momentum by showing results, focusing on the outcomes, and then doing it over and over again.
So I would add that, I think part of what disabled us from making housing and homelessness and housing instability a political priority quite frankly, is because there's been other noise in the space. There's been other folks that have been, or other issues, whether it's the health pandemic or the economic pandemic, all of those things have been in space. So now that we can look to the horizon and look to a plan like the Roadmap Home, how do we create that political will to make that happen? And I do think it's the human aspect of this. And, you know, unfortunately, it's the human suffering. It's what being unhoused, experiencing housing instability, all of those things and how they impact individuals that elected officials represent. I think that's the really important piece. So, and I said this earlier, is having people with lived experience and telling their story and telling how it's impacted their lives constantly up in Sacramento, because they do need to hear from us, or locally at the state level. That is a really critical part in housing becoming a higher part of the political agenda throughout the state.
Thank you all. I'm gonna just ask the audience to give you a virtual round of applause. It's been a pleasure hearing from each of you, hearing about how you think boldly and are bringing together this growing active collective for change. There's a couple things that I need to remind our guests before we break. First of all, we want you to enjoy your lunch break, but we also want to invite you to check out the HCD office hours to learn about our state's COVID-19 rent relief program. And we are super excited to have you rejoin us at 1 o'clock. So go to lunch, but please come back for a plenary conversation with key housing and homelessness leaders in the legislature. You'll get to hear from Senator Scott Wiener and Assemblymember David Chu, moderated by Sacramento Bee reporter Hannah Wiley and Housing California's Policy Director Chris Martin. So please come back for that afternoon session. And again, huge appreciation to each of you and to Matt and the staff that helped pull together the Roadmap Home 2030. Hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.